Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 304. I'm the host, Kyle Anzalone. I have a lot to cover on today's show, including Mexico offering asylum to Julian Assange, news on the war in Ukraine, and the U.S. continuing to provoke China. So share today's show. You can find it at the Libertarian Institute. We repost the show on the blog at antiwar.com. Video version goes up at YouTube, Rumble, and Odysee. You can listen to the show anywhere you could listen to audio podcasts, and it's also on the Libertarian Institute all podcast feed, along with the Scott Horton Show and Liberty Weekly. You can support the show by donating at Patreon or Subscribestar, and the crypto information is in the show notes page. If you would like to support our sponsor, that is a huge help for the show, because every time one of our listeners uses the promo code PEACE, PEACE, when they check out at Paloma Verde, they will be getting a 20% discount, and the show will be getting a kickback on that order and no extra charge to you. And so this is a great way to help out the show and for you to get your CBD at a great price. All of Paloma Verde's products are lab tested. They work fantastically. My favorite is the sports cream, but man, do people rave and review about their CBD dog treats. I have person after person telling me that especially for their older dogs, they find these treats to be very helpful. So you got an aging dog, or hell, you're aging a little bit, got a little bit of back pain, knee pain, working out a lot, muscle pain. Check out the products they got at Paloma Verde. They could definitely make your life better. Paloma Verde, CBD.com, promo code PEACE. All right, let's do it and get into today's show. First up is an article by Dave DeCamp on July 18th. Very exciting. Got some good Assange news. This does not happen often enough. Mexican president renews offer to grant asylum to Julian Assange in letter to Biden. On Monday, Mexican President Andres Manuel López Obrador said he delivered a letter to President Biden last week where he pleaded for the U.S. not to prosecute Julian Assange and renewed an offer to grant asylum to the WikiLeaks founder. This guy, I think, is often known by AMLO, his initials, or Lopez Obrador, said he had explained in the letter that Assange did not cause anyone's death, did not violate any human rights, and that he exercised his freedom, and that arresting him would mean a permanent affront to the freedom of expression. Beautifully articulated there, to say it in just like one sentence, in a way that maybe Joe Biden is capable of comprehending and understanding it. That was very well laid out. The Mexican leader said that he previously offered asylum to Assange in a letter to President Trump at the end of his term, and again at the beginning of the Biden administration. Last month, López Obrador called Assange the best journalist of our time. Assange faces up to 175 years in prison for exposing U.S. war crimes by publishing documents he received from whistleblower and former Army soldier Chelsea Manning. López Obrador said earlier this month that if Assange is sentenced to life in prison, there should be a campaign to dismantle the Statue of Liberty. If they bring him to the U.S. and sentence him to the ultimate penalty, to death in prison, then we will have initiated a campaign for dismantling the Statue of Liberty presented by France because it was no longer a symbol of liberty. While López Obrador is outspoken in his support for Assange, who is an Australian citizen, Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese is not. Albanese rejected calls for him to demand that that Washington drop the extradition request. Now, I did talk on the show about some reports that maybe behind the scenes Australia had raised the issue on one or two occasions with the U.S., but certainly short of the actual support that Assange needs. Assange is currently being held in London's Belmarsh prison. British Home Secretary Priti Patel has approved the extradition of Assange to the U.S., and the WikiLeaks founder's legal team has launched an appeal to her ruling on July 1st. Assange is indicted on 17 counts of espionage and 1 count of conspiracy to commit computer crime for his role in obtaining and publishing the leaks provided by Manning. But Assange used journalistic practices to obtain the information, something many human rights groups, journalist organizations, and UN officials have pointed out. So, of course, everybody in this audience knows how huge the Assange story is, how important it is that we keep him out of American jail and we keep the U.S. courts from basically permanently making any kind of real journalism illegal. You know, what they're going to do is they're going to make it so the only people who can report on information leaked from government employees are people who are reporting on information that the government leaked to them, not in order to expose a wrongdoing within the government, but to further the government's policies, right? And so sometimes we'll see, say, the government leak that China is going to give more Russian weapons to Russia for their war effort in Ukraine. And then we find out later from Ken Delinian in NBC News, they report that, hey, this is part of the West information war, and it's not really true. And so those are the leaks that we'll continue to get, the leaks that aren't even true, but all the actual important information that has been brought to us by WikiLeaks over the years, or outlets like the Gray Zone, is going to increasingly become criminalized. And it's great that the Mexican president is making this offer. Now, I would be interested to see what the response from the Assange legal team is here. My assumption is that they would be happy to accept this asylum agreement. I'm not sure if Mexico would work as a long-term home for Assange. The U.S. does have a lot of influence there, and so they could lean on the election or something like that to try to get a more friendly person put into office, or try to leverage a lot of economic support, international aid, international loans, international joint projects, things like that, in order to make it so economically unviable for Mexico. Either the president ends up dropping it, or the Mexican people don't want to suffer economically so much for just this one guy, and that's not a big enough point in the polls in the election, and they vote on a different issue, elect a different president, and that president just ships him north of the border. I think that's a very possible scenario. But at the same time, this does seem to be a way for Assange to get out of the immediate crisis, hopefully get some medical care, get to spend some time with his family, his wife, his kids, go outside, enjoy the sun, enjoy a couple of Mexico's beautiful beaches, and then, seek where he could find a permanent home to raise his family, and maybe if he chooses to resume his important work as a journalist and at WikiLeaks. I think that's all I have on Assange today. Next up is an article I wrote for the Libertarian Institute on July 18th, titled "Homeland Security Advisor Tells Agency to Abandon Disinformation Governance Board." A Department of Homeland Security advisor issued a one-sentence statement saying the agency has no need to revive its Disinformation Governance Board. The board was headed by Nina Jankowicz, but collapsed shortly after it was rolled out. The White House announced the Disinformation Board in April. The board was already in operation for 2 months before Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas informed Congress. The DHS head said the new board would combat disinformation spread by foreign states such as Russia, China, and Iran. After the board was announced, Jankowicz was made its head. She is a self-labeled expert on disinformation. However, she had previously promoted several infamous stories from the Russiagate conspiracy that were revealed as disinformation generated by the Hillary Clinton campaign. Jankowicz also targeted the Hunter Biden laptop story in 2020. She boosted the evidence-less claim that the younger Biden's laptop was disinformation from Russia meant to interfere in the coming presidential election. Of course, we now know that those emails are all, real, and it was a legitimate story, not based in Russia at all. On May 18th, Jankowicz resigned and the board's activities were paused. Now, I think people are calling her Scary Poppins, and of course she had gotten into feuds with Aaron Mate. Obviously, she was very unprofessional, and not probably the right person for any government job, but particularly this one, right? Not that this job should exist, but, I think a lot of people who maybe wouldn't have had a problem with the Disinformation Board were very uncomfortable with Jankowicz because she was so obviously very politically biased and slanted in one direction that this was going to be a 1984-esque department. Now, a lot of us, I think what we thought would happen is that after this thing was paused on May 18th, that DHS would wait a few months. They would appoint a far more boring, less recognized, like a real just unnamed bureaucrat type to come head up this board and to carry on its mission, probably in the same way as if Jankowicz was in charge, just, not being the lightning rod, likely, whoever heads it. And but rather we have now this statement from the DHS advisory group suggesting the agency's leadership will not try to revive the Disinformation Board anytime soon. Most of the group's advisors are appointed by the head of DHS. The Washington Post reports the advisory group's one sentence statement was made during the public session of a meeting that was held via audio only. Officials did not identify all the members on the call or respond to questions afterwards, so we don't really have much more information about it. I think that they're hoping this just kind of quietly goes away at this point. Now, I don't think what happened here was necessarily that the idea that the Biden administration was going to try to control information has dissipated, right? Like, that's not gone. It's just gone in this form. A lot of people are pointing out when I wrote the article, and I was just trying to write it up on this particular story to note that, look, the advisory board is saying that there's no need to continue with the Disinformation Governance Board, but we have seen in recent weeks, maybe why the need is no longer there. NPR has announced they have their own disinformation desk now, and so I think we're going to see more of that. And unfortunately, in a way, that's going to maybe carry more legitimacy than if it was the government doing it, just because it's going to seem like it's a less biased actor. Of course, it's really not. All right, the next article I have that I wrote for the Libertarian Institute, same date, July 18th, titled, Zelensky fires intel chief for failing to identify traitors, says U.S. says it will continue to provide past Kiev intelligence. So Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky fired two top officials claiming they allowed traitors to remain in their post. The White House said the evidence that Kiev's intelligence services is deeply compromised will not allow stop the flow of information to Ukraine. The SBU chief Ivan Bankoval and Prosecutor General, I'm not even going to try to say this woman's name, were dismissed by executive order on Sunday. Zelensky claimed members of their agencies collaborated with Moscow. And then this is from the Zelensky statement. 651 criminal proceedings have registered regarding treason and collaboration activities of employees of prosecutors' offices, pretrial investigation bodies, and other law enforcement agencies. 198 criminal proceedings, relevant persons were notified of suspicion. In particular, more than 60 employees of the prosecutor's office and security services of Ukraine remain the occupation and are working against our state. The two officials are the highest level employees fired by Zelensky since Russia invaded in February. The head of the SBU was, which, by the way, the SBU is like the FBI and the CIA combined. They do domestic law enforcement and, espionage, intelligence gathering, CIA-like activities. And the former SBU head was a close childhood friend of Zelensky. And so there's a couple points people are making here. There's a lot of significant angles that we could take with this story. We'll get into one from Quincy in a second here. Consolidation of power is a possibility. I think it's fair to raise some questions how much what Zelensky is saying here is true. Like how, they've made a lot of accusations in Ukraine about potential traders and things like that. And you wonder how many of them are true. That being said, there are a lot of them, and given the dynamics of Ukraine and Russia, I wouldn't really be surprised if there are some. So while Kiev is concerned about Moscow's infiltration of its intelligence agency, the White House says that will not prevent the U.S. from passing intelligence to Ukraine. This is from State Department spokesperson Ned Price. We are in daily contact with our Ukrainian partners. We invest not in personalities, we invest in institutions. We have an intelligence sharing relationship with our Ukrainian counterparts. We continue to proceed ahead with that. The U.S. has provided intelligence to Ukraine throughout the conflict. Some unnamed U.S. officials have claimed the information was vital in killing Russian generals and sinking some of Moscow's ships in the Black Sea. All right, now to this Quincy piece. Who wrote this one? It might be Connor Eccles. Yeah, Connor Eccles wrote this for Quincy on July 19th. Zielinski's firings creates concerns about corruption, Russian moles. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky fired 2 top law enforcement officials on Sunday, saying they failed to root out cases of suspected treason in their agencies. And announcing the move, Zelensky also revealed his government is investigating 650 potential cases of treason by security officials. Experts say these high-profile firings reveal Ukraine's government is more penetrated by Russian intelligence than previously assumed. Russian intelligence has been rather successful in penetrating the Ukrainian government, particularly in Ukraine's eastern and southern regions, said George Beebe, I think is how you say his name, of the Quincy Institute. According to Beebe, this is the level of penetration is not surprising given the Russian officers have been working to build support in Ukraine since the fall of the Soviet Union. They know the people, they think they're operating on home turf, so to speak, he said, and they're certainly Ukrainians, particularly in the east and south, who feel unfairly discriminated against by Ukraine's central government. The 2 former officials, prosecutor general and security chief, were close with Zelensky, but had little to no experience in government. Bibi, who previously had a CIA's Russia team, argues that the pair's lack of bureaucratic knowledge doomed them from the start. Imagine President Biden appointing a foreign friend from Delaware as head of the CIA who had no experience in intelligence. It's not very surprising that these people haven't performed well. The shakeup also created conversations about Washington's cooperation with Ukrainian officials, which includes sharing potentially sensitive information related to the war. All right. Moving on, the next article is from Dave DeCamp from July 17th at antiwar.com. U.S. implies Ukraine can use HEMAS against Russian targets in Ukraine. The State Department on Sunday implied Ukrainian forces are allowed to use U.S.-provided high-mobility artillery rocket systems, HEMAS, against Russian targets in Crimea, which Russia has controlled since 2014. When the U.S. first announced it was sending a HEMAS to Ukraine, Biden administration officials said they received assurances from Ukrainian officials that the rockets would not be used to target Russian territory. As if the ban on the Ukraine using the HEMAS to target Russian territory applies to Crimea, the State Department spokesperson told antiwar.com, Crimea is Ukraine. The United States does not and will not recognize Russia's purported annexation of Crimea. We continue to stand up against Russia's unprovoked and justified war against the people of Ukraine. And this is really a wild statement to make, especially since it seems that any end of this war in Ukraine will, a necessity of Kiev will have to be to make a concession that involves recognizing Crimea and at least part of the Donbass as Russian territory. If that does not happen, I don't think the war ends. The U.S. is saying we're never going to recognize Crimea as Russian territory, which is firmly held Russian territory and has been for 8 years now. It is just an absurd stance to take and means that they really do want this war to go on likely for years, if not basically indefinitely. On Saturday, a Ukrainian intelligence official said that Ukrainian forces should start attacking Russian facilities in Crimea and suggested the U.S. provided HIMARS could be used for such strikes. Former Russian Russian President Dmitry Medvedev, who currently serves as deputy chair of Russia's Security Council, warned Sunday that if Ukraine launched attacks on Crimea, it would mean doomsday for Ukrainian leadership. Should anything of this kind happen, they will be faced with a doomsday, very quick and tough immediately. There will be no avoiding it, but they keep on provoking the situation by such statements. It's not exactly clear if he means doomsday there as in a nuclear strike on Kiev, but certainly significant strikes on Kiev, and likely means attempted decapitation strikes against Zelensky himself. Medvedev also stated the fact that Ukraine and Western nations don't recognize Crimea as Russian territory poses a systematic threat to Russia. If any state, either Ukraine or NATO territory, thinks Crimea is not a part of Russia, that is a systematic threat to us. The HIMARS and the U.S. sent to Ukraine are equipped with munitions that can reach targets of 50 miles away. The rocket systems could be outfitted with longer range rockets, but the U.S. chose the 50-mile range and sought assurances that they won't be used to target Russian territory over fears that such attacks risk escalating the conflict. But since Russia considers Crimea its territory, any attack on the peninsula would appear to be a major escalation and would risk provoking a response from Moscow. So obviously, the Biden administration's position here just really doesn't make a lot of sense. All right, and it looks like we are moving ahead with this. I read first at the Miami Herald, and then I also saw Dave DeCamp covered this. Ukrainian preparing to target Russian Black Sea fleet with Western weapons. A Ukrainian military official told the Times on Monday that Ukraine is preparing to target Russia's Black Sea fleet with Western-provided arms. We have a permanent threat from the Russian Black Sea fleet. Given the new technologies and capabilities we receive, we have to address that threat, Ukrainian Deputy Defense Minister Volodymyr Harvudov said. Sorry, I probably said his last name really wrong. Since Russia invaded Ukraine on February 24th, the U.S. and its allies have sent various anti-ship missiles to Ukraine, including U.S.-made Harpoons and British-made Brimstone missiles. In June, Ukraine claims it used 2 Harpoon missiles to sink a Russian tugboat. We are receiving anti-ship capabilities, and sooner or later we will target the fleet. It is inevitable because we have to guarantee the security of our people, the Deputy Defense Minister said. All right, moving on to, I think this is probably the last article of my own I have today. Top senators bat DOJ plan to use RICO law to target Russian assets. The Department of Justice consulted with the Senate Judiciary Committee on a proposal to use laws designed to target the mafia to seize Russian assets. The DOJ's legal scheme won immediate support from the committee's top members. The department's plan calls for the definition of racketeering to be expanded under the Racketeering Influence and Corruption Organizations Act, or RICO Act. And so anybody who has seen an American, gangster movie in the past 20 years or so is probably more or less familiar that, RICO is what the cops in those movies use to try to take down the entire organization. The DOJ recommended the DOJ recommendation will allow U.S. attorneys to charge violations of sanctions and export controls as racketeering. Now, of course, there's civil liberties concerns around the RICO laws, and maybe I'll try to have on a guest in the next few weeks to discuss that, because some of the political nuance I really don't understand as well, but expanding these laws and allowing the federal government to do more is concerning. As defense attorney Noam Bale of the law firm Shear Tormente told The Hill that U.S. courts are unlikely to contest the Justice Department's strategy, but the courts have been quite open to prosecutors using RICO in expansive ways to charge different kinds of organizations. For all the criticisms, I don't see the courts being likely to move in a different direction on this if the government is going to use this statute against Russian oligarchs. After hearing the pitch, Russian Republican Chuck Grassley and Democrat Sheldon Whitehouse, voiced support for the plan. What we're trying to craft here is something that is quite narrow and I believe is consistent with due process concerns of the United States Constitution. Republican Senator Marsha Blackburn asked the DOJ official if the new interpretation of RICO could also be used against China. So these proposals that would aid the prosecution and asset forfeiture for Russia, is that going to extend to other high-level cash-rich criminals like cartels or the Chinese Communist Party? The Department of Justice is targeting the assets of Russia as a part of the U.S. economic war against Moscow. Many Russians who have had their high-value goods targeted have not supported the war launched by President Vladimir Putin, and it's just about punishing Russians in general and really isn't about, any particular plan to impact the war. So sanctions don't work. Of course, we've discussed this in the past on the show. Every time they fail, they don't lead to policy changes. They cause suffering among the poorest people, in these countries, and, the elites are relatively unimpacted. I'm sure for some of these guys, it does suck to lose their yachts, but they have a lot of money. There's a lot of places in the world. I'm sure they'll find nice places to vacation in the future. So on sanctions, this is maybe the biggest news, I think. EU to ease sanctions on Russian banks to allow food trade. The European Union plans to ease some sanctions on Russia by unfreezing funds belonging to top Russian banks to allow the shipment of more grain and fertilizers, Reuters reported on Tuesday, citing a draft EU document. EU diplomats are expected to agree to the amended sanctions on Wednesday. The draft says that the money could be released after having determined that such funds or economic resources are necessary for the purchase. Imports or transporting of agricultural and food products, including wheat and fertilizers. The EU plan comes after African leaders said Western sanctions have had a negative impact on trade. We no longer have access to grain from Russia and especially fertilizers. Macky Sall, the president of Senegal and the chair of the African Union, said in June. The EU officials also told Reuters that the bloc still plans to expand sanctions on Russia. Under the plan, the EU will freeze assets of SureBank, Russia's largest bank, with the exceptions needed for food trade. The EU also plans to facilitate the export of food from Russian ports, which sanctions have hindered despite exemptions. U.S. sanctions also technically have exemptions for food and fertilizer shipments, but the measures discourage shipping firms, banks, and insurance companies from doing business with Russia altogether. Bloomberg reported in June that the U.S. was quietly encouraging companies to purchase and ship more Russian fertilizer. The report said the Biden administration officials were surprised by the caution companies were taking over the sanctions. But history has shown that no matter what exemptions there are, sanctions cause shortages of humanitarian goods. For example, U.S. sanctions on Iran have exemptions for medical goods, but it's still called medical shortages in the country. All right, last story on Russia-Ukraine I have today. Erdogan, that's Turkey's president, renews threat to block Finland and Sweden from joining NATO. And Turkey said that basically these two countries have to agree to all the extraditions that Turkey is asking for. I don't know if this is going to happen. I think this is potentially to really derail the situation here still, but I can't say that for sure, and I can't count on it yet. All right, the U.S. is continuing to provoke China. July 13th, from Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com, the U.S. sailed near Chinese-controlled Paracel Islands in the South China Sea on Wednesday, the latest challenge to Beijing's claims in the disputed waters. And I believe in the past 3 days, I think it was maybe July 18th, the U.S. carried out a second one of these, freedom of navigation, FONOP operations through the South China Sea. We now have the U.S. warning China it will defend Philippines in the South China Sea. The Biden administration reminded China, and this was on Tuesday, July 12th, that the U.S. will intervene to defend the Philippines if Melania's vessels come under attack in the South China Sea. Secretary of State Antony Blinken made the warning in a statement on the anniversary of the International Tribunal ruling that sided with the Philippines against China in the territorial dispute in the South China Sea. The 2016 ruling from the tribunal in The Hague was made under the 1982 UN Convention of the Law of the Sea. The U.S. is not a party to that Law of the Sea, but has also used the treaty to reject China's claims in the South China Sea. So, of course, if the U.S. had like Cuba as a neighbor, it has Cuba as a neighbor. Well, if Cuba claims its territorial waters extended everywhere but right off of the, very close to the Florida coast, and then China was trying to sail its warships through those waters, not very far, 30, 40 miles or so, I guess, from the Florida coast, I think the U.S. would be pretty upset and really have something to say about that. So important way of looking at this. And the U.S. has a big plan to counter China. U.S. to open new embassies, increase aid in Pacific region to counter China. The U.S. announced on Tuesday that it will be expanding its diplomatic presence in the Pacific, increasing aid to the region as a part of a strategy to counter Chinese influence. Vice President Kamala Harris detailed the plan in a virtual address to the Pacific Island Forum, which is being held in Fiji. Harris said that the U.S. will be starting the process to open embassies in the Pacific Island nations of Tonga and Kiribati. She said the U.S. will appoint its first ever envoy to the PIF and that the U.S. Agency for International Development will expand its presence in the region. Now, maybe the aid will gain some positive impact as long as it's meaningful aid and it's not just the U.S. throwing some money at the leadership, which will be used to oppress people or things like that. But one issue you have to look out at here is right before Russia invaded Ukraine, Antony Blinken was not meeting with Sergei Lavrov to try to prevent that information. He wasn't even in Europe. He was in the Pacific, in the Solomon Islands, trying to work with the Solomon Islands to open an American embassy in their country. Well, 2-3 weeks later, China signs a deal with the Solomon Islands, a new security agreement with the Solomon Islands, and the West absolutely freaks out about it, says it's an unacceptable security position. And so I think we're seeing that it really doesn't make a huge difference what if the U.S. has an embassy in these countries. Okay, there's one more story on China I wanted to mention. I saw a press release from the Navy that the Arleigh Burke class destroyer, the USS Spanfold, sailed through the Taiwan Strait. It's the 7th time this year, which, since we're in the 7th month, we're still on the pace of once a month. We are now sending our advanced warships through the Taiwan Strait. All right, a few other stories, Middle East and otherwise, I want to touch on here. Very important stuff going on. U.S. does not support organized violent opposition to the Taliban. Jason Ditz, July 15th. Having lost the Afghan war outright, the U.S. State Department is now saying that their goal is to see the Taliban give rise to stable and sustainable Afghanistan, and that they do not support organized violence against them. It's not just supporting violence against the Taliban, but discouraging other powers from doing so as well. The Taliban isn't facing huge opposition, but the most likely would be groups that were U.S. backed to their outright defeat. This is an awkward position, with the U.S. spending decades positioning the Taliban as irredeemable villains and now warning anyone against resisting their rule, which was secured purely through routing the U.S. failed government. It is not unusual for the U.S. to back the continued rule of that group that's objectively bad. Before the 2001 U.S. invasion of the Taliban, the U.S. was cheerfully backing them, subsidizing them, and praising them for being reliable anti-drug partners. The U.S. may be looking to roll things back to the comfortable old days of protecting the Islamist Taliban. And so I have to say, one of the things in the past year on the show that I really did get wrong was going to be what the Taliban rule in Afghanistan would look like. I really didn't think they would be able to roll back and institute so many of the old, very totalitarian, patriarchal policies, requiring women to wear full coverings, crackdowns on journalists, and things like that. Now, look, the Afghanistan under U.S. warfare for the past 20 years was horrific. I'm not trying to make any commentary on that. I'm just saying that, I want to be forthcoming with my audience, because I did say that, look, most of the old Taliban leadership is dead. These are younger people. And, we're looking at videos of all these Taliban fighters. They're walking around with smartphones and things like that. And so you would assume that there would have been some progress. Maybe eventually that will still come. I'm hopeful for the Taliban people. But at the same time, it has been pretty nasty there. I'm not sure to what extent the U.S. sanctions could possibly be adding to this, of course. Maybe resistance, protests, and things like that is just diminished at this point, because people literally can't feed their children. And so we're trying to, when your problem is in life is that you have 3 children that are starving to death, right? Then my guess is that the Taliban aren't your biggest problem. And so they're not facing as much resistance at this point as they maybe would be otherwise. U.S. claims ISIS leader killed in Syrian drone strike. This was July 12th. Jason Dids from antiwar.com. U.S. officials have issued a statement claiming a strike on Tuesday killed a top ISIS leader, Magar al-Algal. The attack was near Jindaralis in northwestern Syria. Next up, I wanted to mention this. This was, I thought, the more important story on Syria I had. U.S. plans to train 3,500 more Kurdish SDF forces in Syria in 2023. Not only, of course, will this have a huge impact on the battlefield in Syria, which has all kinds of implications, of course, but I think if we're looking at what's happening with Turkey, the U.S. rolling out this plan made Turkey less likely and less open to inviting more countries into the NATO alliance. UN extends Yemen mission in Hodeidah by another year. Just days before its expiration, the UN Security Council voted to extend the mission to support the Hodeidah agreement in Yemen by another year. Hodeidah is the largest seaport in Yemen and a source of most food aid into the country. Pro-Saudi forces were trying to take the port, and the UN made a deal to try to avoid the fight, worrying the port would be damaged, leading to increased famine. It does appear there were some ceasefire violations and some fighting going on in Yemen. This from Jason Dids, July 11th at antiwar.com. 17 killed or injured as Saudis break truce. Locals in northern Yemen are reeling after a weekend Saudi attack in the Sa'da province. At least 17 people were killed either or wounded in a raid on the city of Manbij. The details are still emerging, and it appears that most of the casualties were injuries. The 2 confirmed kills so far were a woman and a 10-month-old infant. The attack took place on Sunday, and the Yemeni media reported the Saudi border guards carried out the shooting. Saudi Arabia has yet to offer details on what happened. That's now unusual for the Saudis, who are not fond to sharing information unless they can spin it to blame the Houthis for something. This incident, by contrast, seems to be getting the Saudis blamed for violating the truce. Now, that's bad news, but there is some good news. There's a potential ceasefire expansion, and this time maybe a substantial one. UN pushes for 6-month ceasefire in Yemen. July 18th, Jason Dids, antiwar.com. With just 2 short weeks left in the current Yemen ceasefire, officials are heading to Oman and southern Yemen to try to negotiate a further extension, potentially adding 6 months to the deal. The ceasefires got their start around Ramadan and have had a runaway success in decreasing civilian casualties. The ceasefire still hasn't led to serious peace talks, but a 6-month deal would provide plenty of time for that. Both sides seem to appreciate that the war itself isn't doing anyone any favors, and the only way out of this conflict is negotiation. If anything, the resignation that negotiation is the only way, sometimes slowing matters with no one wanting to seem too urgent to make peace after years of war. The concern is that the ceasefire wasn't going to last and that most focus on keeping it intact. Now that it's held for months, a longer extension could provide credibility to take more risks in the peace process. Last up, Date to Camp, July 19th, antiwar.com. U.S. bombs Somalia, says 2 al-Shabaab fighters killed. The U.S. launched an airstrike against al-Shabaab in a remote region of Somalia on Sunday, according to AFRICOM. That's the U.S. African Command. AFRICOM said in its initial assessment found that the strike had killed 2 al-Shabaab fighters and claimed no civilians were harmed, although the Pentagon is notorious for undercounting civilian casualties, especially in Somalia. In the past, they always claim, we didn't kill anybody in these strikes, only al-Shabaab. And what do you know, later on, when some journalist finally looks at it, there's a just massive pile of dead bodies left by a U.S. drone strike. All right, everybody, that's the show for today. Hope you all enjoyed it. I am recording a bunch of stuff today, so I will have content for y'all over the next week or so. As I told you all, I'm getting married, so a lot going on in my life, but I will try to still have a show for you. I may miss one. I think I'm one short from my time. I'm not going to be home, but hopefully I will end up with enough episodes to fill out the 3-week schedule for everyone. I got some exciting stuff coming up, so be sure to subscribe to the show somewhere. Recommend it, share it, anything you could do. Really appreciate it. Thanks, y'all. Be back with more shows later in the week.